Well, this is a rare treat in strange times. A conversation, but not only a conversation, but a conversation with a great composer.
With a real person.
A great composer.
Oh, that's
someone who.
very flattering.
No, I was thinking that I have to say this just in case anybody's tuning in, beaming in. That a few years ago, I wish someone had said to me, "Listen to you," so that it didn't take me a bit longer to find out. So I'm going to say very emphatically to people, listen to you.
Well, that's very kind of you.
Just in case there are a few stray people that need to be told. I'm going to begin this time at the beginning. You're born in Jamaica in 1949.
Yes.
And it seems not, just a few years and you're already aware of the piano. Seems significant somehow, your mother having gone to university in Canada and opened her own school, this seems to be the immediate environment you're born into.
You have done your homework. Yes, yes, she did. She was one of the few people, and a woman at that, of her generation to have gone to university. And she was very, very interested in the arts. She had a school, and I lived on the same premises as the school. She would start the school off, we'd had a two-story house usually, and she'd start the school off downstairs, and then eventually there would be outbuildings, other buildings built outside, then we would get the whole house and the school would be there, still on the same premises. So I was brought up with, people walking around with books on their heads and piano lessons and music lessons going on. And I would hear all this, and at the time in Jamaica as well, everything was on the radio. You got classical music, you got pop music, you got folk music, jazz, all sorts. And so I was exposed to all that from a very early age. Yes. And apparently, I don't remember this, but my mother told me later on that at the age of 5, I asked to have piano lessons.
Yes.
And I decided, at that age that I wanted to be a concert pianist. So,
piano is an interesting choice in Jamaica in 1954, isn't it?
Not so much. It was quite prevalent.
Okay.
There were lots of, I always grew up with lots of music studios around the island, and particularly I was from Kingston and St Andrew.
Yes, yes.
And there were many people teaching private lessons.
And when you say about listening to the radio was interesting in Jamaica at the time. Would that, early on, it would have been, I guess, the British Jamaican services, would it have been? Or
no, I think that's even before my time.
Right, so it was when there was a Jamaican service.
There were Jamaican services. There was RJR, Radio Jamaica, and Rediffusion.
Yes, yes.
And there was JBC,
yeah.
Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation. And later on, JBC started its own television programs as well.
Very important, the radio in Jamaica in the 50s.
Oh, it was very important, yes.
And so why do you think you responded so enthusiastically to the piano at 5 years old? Because I think your ambition even was to be a concert pianist.
Yes, for some very strange reason. But I can't answer that question. I don't know why. I just loved it. I loved classical music from that age, and I wanted to be part of it.
And when you say you loved classical music from that age, were you aware of what you were listening to, or was it just music that was coming in and you responded to that more than anything else?
Well, I responded to what I was hearing, but usually I would find out eventually, who the composer was, or that sort of very general thing at that age.
And then what I love about your Wikipedia page, when it gives your titles of your music, a lot of it doesn't really begin until the early 1980s, except one piece from 1959 called Andy.
Yes.
Tell me about Andy.
Andy was a portrait of my dog. It's a golden retriever. And sometimes when I was practicing in the sitting room, Andy would amble through the house by me and amble down to the front gate and amble back. And I just watched him walking, and I decided I wanted to give him something because he was my favorite dog. So I wrote the sort of ostinato bass, which was him waggling his hips as he went along, and that was the beginning of Andy.
Yeah, so there's a kind of compositional sort of angle already at 10 years old, that somehow the gift you wanted to give your dog was a piece of music.
Yes, I suppose it was there, but because I didn't have any role models really of women or black composers, it didn't occur to me that something like that would be possible. So I was aiming for the piano.
So how did it develop then in the 60s?
Well, little by little, I wrote one or two pieces, not very often. It was very sporadic. And it didn't really develop strongly until I started working with dance. But while I was at the academy, I have to confess now that I had keyboard harmony with Richard Stoker.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to take little bits of composition along to him. So I suppose that was my first
But
taste
you're missing out all of the 60s there, though, aren't you? You're jumping to 1970 years. I was just interested in that period in the 60s, what was happening there while you were in Jamaica? What was developing there in terms of you and your relationship with music?
Well, all sorts of things. The Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music was very present in the West Indies. And so each year, I mean, my life was just about going to school, getting my exams, and also about having my piano lessons. And each year, I would take one of the graded exams. So at age 6, I took grade 1, I think. And then in those days, you had to have theory as well to go along with it. So I took grade 1 and then grade 2, and it went on like that for consecutive years. And then I think I had a year out because I had GCs to take at school. So I didn't do a piano exam that year. And then eventually I took grade 8. I think it was, I won a scholarship. I can't remember whether it was grade 8 or LRSM. I think it might have been my LRSM, which is licentiate of the Royal Schools of Music. And the Associated Board would offer a scholarship every 2 years to one person in the West Indies, and I was lucky enough to get one of those. But I had to wait because I was the only child and my parents did not want to get rid of me so quickly. So I had to wait a year to take up the scholarship.
What about your parents in terms of you wanting to be a musician? Was that something they were in favour of, or was that a bit of a shock to them?
I think they were mildly surprised, and especially my mother, who was an academic. She really wanted me to go to university and to have a proper job as a doctor or a lawyer, and I think was quite disappointed when I wasn't wanting to go in that direction. In fact, I shouldn't say this because I think everybody should learn as much as they possibly can in every institution they can, but I stopped after O-levels. I didn't even want to stay on to take my A-levels because I knew I wanted to do music. So that was how it went. My life was filled with music. Meanwhile, at about the age of, 15, 16, I'm not sure, I started working, not really working, but joining the Jamaican folk singers. And I did a bit of singing with them, but very soon they were in need of a guitarist, and I happened to play by ear, so I became their guitarist for a couple of years. And then I think I was, 2 or 3 years I might have been with them. And then when I won the scholarship, of course, I had to leave and came to this country. Waited until 1970.
So what was your view from Jamaica of the British Isles? I mean, how did the independence in 1962, did that make much difference to your life, or
Not really. I wasn't that concerned with it. There were lots of political things going on, but we always had a large taste of British culture, so it was always part of life there, particularly among middle-class Jamaicans. So life carried on as usual. And at independence, instead of trying to get rid of that and go to a more socialistic type of life, I think it got even worse. So the class system got more and more divided. There were people who were much poorer and people who had more wealth. Most middle-class people grew up with having at least one servant, and that was just, that's what you took for granted, and that was what life was about. And little by little, houses had more and more bars put on the windows, and more locks, and more guard dogs, and more security people. So it sort of, you know, it looked as if something wasn't quite right, but nobody stopped to change it. And then, sorry, we're having a political discussion
No,
now.
I'm just interested in that period. One of the things that I really liked about your playlist, for instance, that is attributed to you on Spotify, which is filled with the Shostakoviches and the Messiaens and the Bartoks and your, you know, usual taste. But in the middle of it, there is Millie Small's "My Boy Lollipop." You know, kind of a significant song in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was very significant.
And I wondered why it was for you.
Well, I loved it. That's simply it. And partly because it was so different. She had this extraordinary voice that sounded like a 5-year-old child or something, so high-pitched, and she belted it out, and it was fantastic.
And also, she was pretty much the same age as you as well.
Yes,
15, 16
she would have been
at
the time.
And I remember when she came over, her first thought of London when she arrived was a lot of chimney pots. That it was such a culture shock. And obviously for you, eventually, your parents eventually let you come over. What was the culture shock like coming to Britain from Jamaica?
Actually, not so huge. The biggest thing for me was the climate. I had come over in 1968 with my then piano teacher, Ina Helps, whose studio I went to towards the end, where I won the scholarship and everything. And she came with me, and we did a sort of mini tour. We went to Paris and London and Malvern. So I had some taste of it, and I remember very well my first curry in London. It was a marvelous experience. I'd never seen red food before, and it tasted as good as it looked, and it was brilliant. And we went to Paris. I had a crush on one of the waiters in the hotel. So it was all, you know, I was 18 years old or something. It was you know, amazing.
And what about coming to the Royal Academy in 1970? What was that experience like?
I was quite in awe when I arrived, and this huge building, the huge foyer, the sort of officialdom of everything. I was quite stunned by it all. And I was telling people earlier about this story. When I first came, the first thing that happened was I had to play something to one of the staff here, and I had no idea what winter was like. This was January I came, and I had this big fake fur coat and summer clothes because I had no idea. So I came in, and my hands were absolutely frozen. I could not play. It was quite a fast technical piece. It was a complete disaster. And I was also going to do singing as a second study. So I played the piano, and then I sang a song. And afterwards, he said, "Well, at least you can sing." I've never forgotten that.
And how did it go from there? Any better?
Uphill. It was much better. I had a marvelous piano teacher who I'd met. He came over as an examiner to Jamaica quite a few times, and he taught at the academy. I won the scholarship. I think they staggered it, so people either went to the college for one scholarship thing and then to the academy, and I actually won mine to the college, but because of, it was Dennis Murdoch, and he asked that I asked to come to the academy, so that's what I did, and I studied with Dennis Murdoch, and he became like family to me here. His wife, I think it was his second wife, was Jamaican, so several of his pupils used to visit their home, and he would put on concerts, you know, the pupils would play and he would have one or two people around to listen, especially if we were preparing for exams, so that was very, very useful. So I did
so
that.
You essentially came to study piano, not actually, despite Andy, not composition, you were
no,
coming
it
for
still hadn't occurred to me. I was very slow.
Why was that, do you think? Do you think it was something about, you were thinking of being a performer?
I was thinking of being a performer, and my mind was set on that, and somehow my mind just didn't go anywhere else for quite a while. So I did piano, and I changed from singing second study to a double first. So I did both piano and singing, and I was at the academy for about 5 years, I think.
And how did the experience change your understanding, if you like, of classical music? Because I imagine in Jamaica, the idea of classical music, it impacts your imagination in a different way. I guess you've got to find your way to it. It's somewhere else. It's not with you. The history of it isn't as explicit or as easy to find out or hear. So was there a big change once you got here?
No.
No?
It's exactly the same. I mean, you get the same sort of education. Your teachers try to give you a background of the composers and what their lives were about. So, you know, people think it is a huge culture shock, but really we're swimming in British culture in Jamaica at that time. I think it's changed a lot now, but at that time you were. So it wasn't such a huge change to come, and of course I learned more and more as I went along about the composers and about life in Europe in general.
What about other sort of changes? I guess being brought up pretty much in a matriarchal way with a very strong mother and a very a cultured sort of environment. I wonder what it was like in terms of gender and race when you landed in Britain in the 1970s, because it was extraordinarily backwards in many ways, and oddly Jamaica was more progressive in many ways, its sort of approach to...
Well, Jamaica is a great potpourri of different races, so you know that was never an issue, and I brought that with me, and I decided very early on, from the first time I had someone call me a black bee on the road, I just decided I don't want to have anything to do with this. It's their problem. I'm fine in myself, and in a way I put myself in a bubble as far as that was concerned, and I wanted to do what I set out to do, and I didn't want to be taken on any sort of other tributaries to have anything diffused. So I didn't have a strong political agenda about wanting to put anything to rights, and it's quite recently that I've really started embracing that more, but at the time it wasn't an issue for me. I came from a family, as you say, with a strong mother, so you know I didn't think it was strange for me to be trying to have a career, and the fact that I was black, I'm actually mixed. Nobody ever says you're mixed. As soon as you have a fleck of melatonin, you're black. So, but you know, I have Jewish blood.
Well, it's the Jamaican thing. It's out of many one people. I mean, it seems to be
it's the motto.
Something that we crudely simplify outside. That extraordinary mixture of especially Jamaica as well, with its 5-6 centuries of colonial input and also entrepreneurial input as well. I guess that.
Yes.
there's a big pool of heritage that you have. I guess that's been significant in your music.
And you don't know, I don't know what else I have, but what I know about is, well, definitely African, but I also have Scottish and Jewish blood. So, you know, it's no big deal.
So early on, there's a kind of resistance to the simplicity of just putting you into a box that was of no use to you whatsoever in terms of what you wanted to do as a musician.
No use. So I just wanted to be a person playing the piano as very much as I want to be a person writing music now.
And so tell me about the beginning of the transformation, because I guess the beginning of the transformation happened through dance, didn't it, really? That was where you started to explore writing your own music as opposed to just playing.
Yes, a lot more then. I had quite a history with dance as well. When I was about 16, I used to play for Madame Suhi in Jamaica. And you had all set music. This woman was incredible. I think she died in her 90s in a car accident. And she had this stick she used to pound on the floor, and I would be reading this music. So it started there, and then when I came here, and after I ran out of scholarship money and I was about to leave the academy, the first thing I thought was, well, I'll try playing for some dance classes to get some extra money. Also at the time, all money was cut off from Jamaica. So not allowed, people weren't allowed to send anything. My parents couldn't send me anything. So I had to fend for myself. And so I started playing for dance classes. And to cut a long story short, after a few years, someone told me about the place, which was modern dance. And I found that incredibly freeing, because I'd learned to improvise for ballet classes, but it had to be of a certain flavor. It had to be tonal. It had to sound a certain way to suit the exercises. When I got to the place, you could do virtually anything. It was crazy, you know. It was modern dance for the first place that started real modern dance in this country, which was founded by Robert Cohan, who came from the Martha Graham Company to live here. And I was lucky enough to be asked eventually, after playing in the school, to be the pianist for London Contemporary Dance Theatre. So, and that was an exciting life. We went on tour. I played for every single class. Usually Robert Cohen, Bob, taught the company classes every single day, and I played and improvised for him every single day. So I knew the dance exercises backwards. And I also used anything for the piano. I would have to play. I remember playing some Michael Finnessy for one dance once. It was quite amazing. So anything goes, any sort of music, from Brahms to Finnessy, you know. So that was a wonderful experience as well.
Because I've got one thing in your younger years that also seems significant, was that you had an early crush on Bartok.
Absolutely.
Like 10 or 11, were you, or something?
10, 11, 12, I'm not sure, yes. And that was when I started studying with another Jamaican pianist called Oswald Russell, and he introduced me to Bartok. And I just really, I mean, I loved Bach and everything else, but something in Bartok really spoke to me. And that's carried on all the way through. Really.
Have you ever been able to articulate it better than that? That something spoke to you? Was it the rhythm? Was it the attack?
It was partly the rhythms. It was a lot to do with the harmonies as well. That sort of naked harmony that he uses, quite bare harmonies, and the emotional content, which is sometimes quite bleak, but always, I feel, very honest and very speaking from something that he felt deeply, I think. And I think that's what really appealed to me.
Yeah. So when you were liberated playing with the more avant-garde dance, that enabled you to find these different approaches, different shapes and different attitude. It broke you free of, I guess, the more romantic style that you'd been
Yes,
playing.
exactly. Although romantic style was never my thing. I came to that much, much later. While I was studying the academy, I was much more, I felt much closer to Beethoven and Bach, who were the more classical side of it rather than the romantics.
But it seemed to propel you into the 20th century, this particular experience.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
The experience with Bartok, definitely.
And can you remember a moment when the shift, you know, you can almost feel the transformation between being a player, performer, and a composer? Was there a moment of revelation?
I think there was a bridge. And the bridge was improvising for dance classes, and because that all came out of my creative mind. And then a few choreographers started asking me to write pieces for them, and that's when it started, and that's when I really fell in love with composition in a serious way. And it didn't happen, but it still didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process. I continued being a pianist for a long time. I still am, I think. I'll find out when I go to practice next time. But composition has taken over more and more.
You went out and you did something, you called it consulting with various composers as well.
Yes.
When was that? I mean, you met Birtwistle, didn't you?
That's right. That was around 2000.
Oh, right. So
as late as that.
Right.
So I sort of started, I did everything backwards. I started composing, and then I went to people.
I always thought that was in
taught.
the sort of, I thought that was almost in the late 70s or early 80s or something. So you'd been working on a number of compositions before you did your consulting.
Yes, and then I had a consultancy. I didn't. Harry said to me, why don't you go to Goldsmiths like I did? And I said, no, I don't want to do that. You know, can I just come to you? But he didn't really want to teach me. We had a lovely time at his house where he sort of showed me around the garden and his studio and everything. And then he said, well, it looks like you know what you're doing.
So what did you go to see him for? What did you think might be the result of it? Did you have any hopes that you would get out of that?
Well, I wanted to go and see various people because I wanted to get different perspectives at the time. I'd already been I'd had some help from Michael Finnessy. I'd been to him a couple of times and just had him look over stuff I'd done. And I wanted to do the same sort of thing, but just to get different perspectives from different people.
So what were you looking for then? Because you'd been composing pretty much for nearly 20 years by then.
Well, I wanted to sort of polish up technical things, more that sort of thing. But of course that can't be done in a very short space of time. So I ended up going quite regularly to this one person over a period of about a year. That was Robert Saxton. And I saw him most regularly compared to everyone else.
And what difference did that make? How did that change your...
Well, I found it really encouraging for a start, but he just, you know, if the teacher says just a few things that are the right things, they can really make a change. They can turn something and make something develop.
Sure.
And that's what I think happened.
And
so
in the previous, I think your first compositions tend to be dated of the early 80s, 82, 83.
Yes.
So when did you decide that this was a finished composition and it was something that you were now beginning to work on a series of compositions? When was the moment when you decided that you'd reached that stage?
You know that word deadline?
Right.
Well, the first piece was Jamaican Medley that happened like that. I was asked to write a piece for Jamaica's 21st anniversary, and there was a deadline and I had to perform it at a concert, so that piece had to be a finished piece. And since then, that's usually what's happened. Something has to be played or used for a particular event, so it's finished whether I like it or not.
Yeah, and I was always interested in a way when it's interesting. The first commission was that, because I was wondering what it's like when you are a certain type of composer, that people will be commissioning for certain occasions and events and representatives of certain national occasions because of the person that they perceive you to be.
Yes.
I mean, is that both encouraging, but also in a way blocks you in because you want to break out of those boxes,
yes.
and yet in a way you're seen as someone that keeps sort of being of help when they think, oh, who do we need?
Yes, all of the above. It blocks you in, but it also gives you an opportunity to do something. And I mean, I am Jamaican, so if I get asked to do something for Jamaica's anniversary, that's quite a positive thing to be asked for. But when someone rings up and says, can you write us a piece about slavery or something? I think, no. Why are you asking me? What do you expect, you know? And I don't like to be pigeonholed and put into a bracket in that way. So.
And so when you wrote that first piece, for instance, what did you decide you would bring in of a kind of Jamaica, if you want, that wouldn't be the usual, the expected? You know, what atmosphere did you feel had been neglected about what a Jamaican experience is?
I'm afraid I didn't even try to go there. It was very Jamaican. I used all Jamaican folk songs. Yeah. And that's one aspect of how I write. That's part of me. I didn't mind doing it at all. Yeah. And I continued to do not Jamaican folk songs, but similar sort of light, tonal, rhythmic music for several years alongside other things I was doing.
Because it's interesting when you talk about, I mean, I've seen you talk about minimalism, and you made the reference to, in fact, how a lot of minimalism really came out of African rhythms. And
yes.
A lot of those African rhythms would have been heard through the centuries in the Jamaican hills, for instance, seeping down into all forms of Jamaican music. I mean, were you interested in that kind of element as well?
No, not really. I suppose I touched on it because I was with the Jamaican folk singers and it was there in the background. But at the time I didn't have the interest to really explore that. I didn't explore it to any extent until I actually was asked to join an African dance company, a semi-professional outfit. Again, a long story. From the academy, a few people were asked to travel to Malta to explore other people's culture. And I was doing both Indian dances and African dances, and I had to choose between one or the other, and I chose the African. And I was with them for, I don't know how long, either 2 or 3 years as a dancer. And at first, it was just perplexing to me. I couldn't hear anything but just this noise of all these drums going. But little by little, you start to pick out, and as they train you, you start to pick out the great sort of counterpoint of rhythms that's going on. And you have to, some dances have a master drum, and you have to really listen to that because that's telling you what the next step is. So that was really exciting. And that's when I learned most about African rhythms and music.
You've said that the early music was much more sort of within your sort of memory of the Caribbean, if you like, West Indian music, and it seems to be that you sort of developed outside of that relatively quickly in terms of your composition and the influences. It became much more the European side of you. Again, a clumsy term, but you know, a different sort of set of influences, still part of your mix, but a different.
Well, the thing is, both of those things have always been there from the age of whenever, from birth probably. Yeah. You know, everything was there, European music as well as Jamaican music. I didn't really go into anything very African apart from, as you say, hearing sort of drum beats that have come down through the centuries as part of the heritage. But yeah, those both things have always been there.
Because it's the idea of the composer almost inventing their own land, if you like, their own world, their own set of continents. It seems to be the composers that you most respond to have had that they may have taken from folk roots, and they may have responded to a certain, literal linear history of Western classical music, but their dream is to break free of that.
Yes.
And create a limbo almost, a world that you're creating for yourself. I guess the country is called the imagination, if you like.
Absolutely, and I think that's the important thing for musicians, to live in that part of yourself and to give something, and also to find your own voice and produce something that's yours, even though, all of us are influenced by goodness knows how many things, and we all hear all sorts of different music, and you can't just blot it out and wipe it out. But I think for me, the idea of, I call it putting it through your own factory and then developing something, or something coming out of it that has something to do with what you have to say, is very important.
Can we talk about when you decided to write certain types of pieces? In the early 90s, you come to the string quartet. So what is your decision about I guess it's a commission, is it? You've been asked?
I was asked.
You were asked, okay.
Yes,
and then what happens to you? You think, okay, a string quartet. What am I going
quartet, first, terror and sheer fright, because, look who's written string quartets through the centuries before. But then great opportunity, and this was a quartet. I knew some of the people in the quartet, and I also had great terror of writing for strings, because I knew nothing about how to play. I knew how to play a piano. I didn't know anything about how violins and cellos worked. So it was also a great challenge, but I could hear the sounds, and I knew what I wanted to put down. I could hear what I wanted to put down. So the challenge was getting to the end result and trying to learn as much as I could during the process.
And this is one of those occasions when sort of it's about something, or you've had an idea. I think extra musical, you say. This is a response to something you've read about or seen.
Yes, the first quartet certainly was. I think it was a physics lecture that I'd been to, and discovered that we're all made of stardust, and that idea was just so sort of mind-blowing to me that I wanted to do something about that. So I particularly, the whole piece is filled with that, but the first movement is all about what I envisage as atoms and particles spinning around before anything is formed, and trying to merge and going separate ways. And the second movement is almost like being in space and stargazing, looking at the planets from space. And then the third movement is more earthy. It has definitely dance elements and strong rhythms, but then the other movements do come back. I refer to both other movements in the last movement as well.
But how do you find that relationship between writing a piece of music that is essentially about something, or has a concept, if you like, and some of the purer works you do, which are literally just they're abstract, they're trying to avoid it being about anything as such.
Yes.
They're coming from a dream or something inside you that isn't a particular thing. It's not a flower or a tree, it's something vague. Your string quartets, to an extent, the three of them tell us a lot about, as a great set of string quartets often does, tells us a lot about your overall compositional process, doesn't it? So it seems to begin with the first one, which is about something. You've responded to something, and they seem to get more abstract, if you like.
Well, I change between one thing and the other, and what I would say about extra musical ideas in my experience is that I can find them very nourishing to get the imagination going, to get the ideas, but one always ends up as if you're writing an abstract piece, because in the end what you have to be thinking about is how you're going to work with the pitches and with the structure and with very sort of elemental things to do with music itself and sound, rather than, you can't be thinking of how pretty the birdies are when you at that stage, you know, you have to.
So for you, what's the difference between the first string quartet and the second one in those terms? Because the second one is more of a process, isn't it? The
second one is completely abstract. Abstract, and I decided I wanted to write a compressed form. It, again, commissions are both a wonderful thing and also a sort of enclosing thing. This one had to be a certain time limit, about 15 minutes. So that caused me to make certain decisions. I decided it's going to be one movement. I also decided I wanted to be some compressed form with various aspects of, say, a sonata form. So there are adagio bits, there are scherzo bits. So that's what I did. And the whole piece came out of, I think it was about the first bar, just a few notes, and the whole thing expanded from there, just working with those pitches and manipulating them in different ways.
Sort of unfolds.
And the rhythms. And
was that an idea you found anywhere, or did that seem to be an idea that was completely something you just had as a breakthrough moment? Or did you see reference points and precedents for that?
No, I think it had happened. All these things seem to have sort of been there, and they expand more in some pieces than others. But I think I'd done something like that before, but maybe not to that extent.
And then the third one, it seems to come from within you. So we've been out of space, and now we're in inner space, which I always think is a wonderful contrast. Would that be the case? Is that much more not autobiographical, but is that something that seems to be just coming from within?
That's difficult. They all come from within.
Sure,
I would say.
But not from a physics lecture. That one.
Wasn't from a physics lecture. It could have been from one idea in the piece came from Tom and I going on holiday, and I was fascinated with this bubbling sort of water coming up from the ground. There was a sort of spring, and it made this amazing sound against some pebbles. And in the first movement, that's depicted. But apart from that, it wasn't really anything. I sort of pasted on an idea afterwards, because I think, you know, people like to have program notes with some sort of story that people can connect with. So I made it about water, but really it was a piece of music. That was a piece of music.
Yes.
And because of that bubble thing, I thought, well, let's go with the idea.
I think that's what I'm sort of trying to get to, the idea that somehow people feel more comfortable if they feel a piece of music is about something. Like with Holst, the Planet, you know, originally it's just pieces for orchestra, or the Schoenberg is, and that's too austere. And as soon as it becomes about something, people sort of fall in love with it. I kind of wonder, you know, whether sometimes you have to wrap it in a narrative when in fact it's beyond a narrative.
Yes, absolutely. And I can see both points of view, because we want to encourage as many people as possible to love classical music. So if you have to put a story on something to get them to have a link and connect, then I think that's all right.
But as a composer, though, in terms of the actual moment of discovery, of finding something, that's not so important for you, is it? I don't think. That it's about a bubbling spring.
No, it's not. It's not. It might give a sort of impression in the imagination that causes what the sounds tend towards, but in the end it's not. It's about the structure. For me, I'm always concerned with structure and form and shape. They're all the same thing, I suppose.
And to what end? What is that?
Well, I think it's much more satisfying, both for me and I hope for people who listen to. It's like the difference between maybe reading James Joyce
Yeah, go on.
and reading Shakespeare or something. I don't know.
Okay.
You know, if you sort of spake with a refrigerator bottle and explain not what, it doesn't make sense. But if you speak in a sentence that everyone understands, it has some form of structure, and it makes sense. But you can also make sense of something that's complete nonsense. That's not a structure. That's the structure because it hasn't got a structure, because it goes from Z to X or so I don't know what I'm saying. I'm saying everything's possible, really.
Also, that intellectual side, which you never desert or ignore, it seems to be a key, but you always sort of obviously have the emotional side as well. But the intellectual side is interesting, because I guess that's the area of danger in terms of making it accessible. You obviously responded very young to something like Bartok, but I guess the bigger question is that a lot of people don't. And I've always been fascinated by the way, as a persona, you know, there's a friendliness and a calmness, a zen quality, and yet sometimes the music is pretty Joycean, if you like. And I wonder if that's also something you have to think about, that you obviously want to reach an audience, you want to, the music in a broader sense, reach an audience, but what you do sometimes is not necessarily going to encourage a casual listener to want to respond, even though possibly they will find things rhythmically and melodically that are very enjoyable, but they don't know that somehow because they think it's too abstract.
Writing music can be quite a schizophrenic experience, because there are all those things that play for me all the time, because it's not a vacuum. You're writing music, and I suppose you're writing music because you want it to be heard, you want it to be performed, and whether you like it or not, people are going to respond to it. So for me, that's a question. I'm never thinking, oh, I don't care about the audience, I'm just going to write this, you know, I'm going to write it in such a complex and extraordinary way that no one can unpick anything. I'm not interested in that. I want to communicate.
Yes, but in that sense, is it disappointing that a couple of things you wrote in the 90s, like the opera and the settings of Roald Dahl that you did, they're in the middle distance somewhat, aren't they? They're incredibly powerful and very accessible. But I wondered if you were disappointed that you managed to achieve the balance, and yet still they didn't quite break through, if you like, in terms of to a wider audience.
Well,
equivalents have, in a sense, you know. I just wondered if that's the area where you wonder.
Well, I try not to think about that. I have to be true to myself. I think that's really what my life is about, being true to myself and true to humanity and others as well. So I like not to think in terms of, is this going to break through or is this not going to break through. I wrote the opera that I wanted to write, and I wrote the piece for Dahl that I wanted to write, and they're there. It's not for me to reason why.
No, I'm sorry to bring that up. That was rather rude of you. I think it was a personal thing.
Be rude is fine.
It was a personal thing. Especially the Dahl. I always felt that the Dahl, you know, I could imagine that being a pretty good annual festival of some sort musically. So I think you've touched on it in other areas of a disappearing of a certain type of composer, if you like, for whatever reason that has historically happened. And you kind of do wonder sometimes why that might be the case, you know, why there is that very peculiar history that gets written and things sort of disappear.
Yes, well, that seems to be part of life, really. Some things come into trend and some things go out, and it fluctuates constantly. And I think the big test is, you know, in 100 years, what will people listen to? I mean, would we know about Bach if Mendelssohn hadn't come along and pushed it a bit?
Can you tell me a little bit about the Roald Dahl settings? Because I think that was quite an exciting idea for you, wasn't it? The turning on its head the notion of Snow White, if you like.
Oh, it was absolutely an amazing experience and opportunity for me. I was given a huge orchestra, which I love to play with huge palettes for orchestras, and I was given choice of the stories. In fact, I started off with, I think it was Goldilocks, and the narrator, who's a dear friend now, so I can say this, got rather annoyed when a few months down the line I decided I didn't want to do Goldilocks, I wanted to do Snow White. But that's what spoke to me, and I found the words very amusing and all the rest of it. It wasn't a problem at all working with that, because being given those words to write music to, it already solves one problem of, you know, what are you going to write? Well, it's going to have to be about this character and that character and what happens there and there. So you already have problems solved and decisions made for you. And I was very excited by the whole thing. It was a wonderful experience. Letter came through the letterbox out of the blue, and apparently Dahl's widow, Lissy Dahl, had heard something of mine on the radio and said to the narrator, who was also sort of running the organization at the time, I think we should have, because Roald had a connection with Jamaica, and she said, I think we should try and get hold of that girl, Hamburger. So that's how it started.
I think what's wonderful about it is the amount of energy there is, the force of personality you get into it. To me, it is actually another side of where you come from that isn't often thought. I mean, you know, Jamaica's known as the loudest island on the planet.
Is it?
For obvious reasons, you know, the sound systems and everything. But to me, you're definitely part of that with those pieces, those more assertive pieces, if you like. It's sometimes. I also particularly like it if you're, like with the proms piece, when you get asked to do something and it's, you know, it's pretty obvious, you know, what they're wanting from you in terms of women and that kind of thing, and then you give them something that has a real kind of suppressed anger, even in the middle of a proms evening. There's something I think you're saying something else in the piece, apart from what it appears to be.
Yes, I think I am as well. Let's not go into too much detail.
That's all I needed.
Yes.
Can I ask you about a couple of collaboration or partnerships that you've had, musical partnerships in your life with? Seem very important. David Angel of the Magini Quartet.
Yes.
And obviously your husband Tom.
Yes.
I mean, how important have they been in terms of giving a sort of almost like a spine through your compositions?
Well, David Angel, I consider, well, he's no longer with us, but I considered him one of my closest friends, if not my closest friend, from the time I came to England. And he introduced me to Tom, so he had a huge impact on my personal life in that way. But also he was a great encourager. He believed in what I was doing, and I think he led himself and Tom, although Tom was never in the quartet when the pieces were being done. But both he and Tom encouraged the commissions to happen. I had 2 commissions from the Magini Quartet.
Yeah.
So he was a great supporter. And he's an absolutely wonderful person, a wit, so funny, and totally committed and wonderful musician.
And do you think without those commissions maybe you would never have got to a string quartet? Do you think that was something that
I might not have.
And why haven't you written another one since 2001?
Good question. I would like to.
You've written 2 violin concertos. They were about 20 years apart, weren't they?
Yes.
Yes.
That's sort of what happens, really.
The first one, I think 2001, was it?
Yes.
Can you tell me about that, and in terms of the relationship as well, and the idea that, again, for me, you seem to refresh another format that could possibly be style, the concerto. You seem to bring new vigour to it. Do you think there was something to do with it being with Tom?
You. Oh, definitely. I love Tom's playing, and I think he's fantastic, and he brings a lot of energy, pours himself into his playing completely, and I wanted to take advantage of that. And we got a chance to do it because someone who's now a dear friend, Joseph Svensson, was working with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra at the time, and he brought about the commission for the first concerto. But he happened to have listened to some lighter pieces, so he was quite surprised when this concerto arrived. But nevertheless, he did an amazing job, and Tom was fantastic. I was very, very happy with.
And why was there a gap between those two then? Is that just, again,
well, I always, you notice I call it Violin Concerto No. 1.
So.
Because I always had in mind that there was going to be another one, but I don't know. This time is a strange thing. So it might not have happened consecutively, but eventually I'm very pleased that it did come about.
Yeah. Can I ask you, I guess we're nearly finished, are we? I guess. Can I ask you just in general, again, I'm afraid it's one of those horrible, general, possibly deeply stupid questions, but just the change in terms of the positioning of those dreadful, the gender race thing. If you felt that there is a genuine change in how you feel you're kind of talked about, positioned, I know you don't really want to think about it, but just a general sense, and you mentioned earlier that you had changed a little bit in terms of your thinking about those issues. How you think the situation is at the moment?
I was much more ready in the past few years to encourage thoughts about that sort of thing and to look at the injustices and all this sort of thing. But again, I still hold that you have to live your life as a person, as do the best you can in your life, produce the best work you possibly can, be as kind to as many people as you possibly can, and that's what my life is about. So, if there are huge injustices, that seems to be part of life. When I was younger, I used to think, oh, we're improving all the time, things are going to get better, there are not going to be so many wars. And now I don't think that. I think the world goes on exactly in the same way, and we're probably not that different from medieval times, apart from maybe we smell a bit better now. But it's just part of the human condition that there are negative sides to things and positive sides to things, and we can just do the best we possibly can in the situation that we're in, and with what we're given. And that's it.
I'd like to finish actually just by asking you about pretty much my favourite of your pieces, which is Succubus Moon, and how that came about, because essentially that began with you and Tom moving into the country in the middle of nowhere, surrounded. For me, it's been very resonant this year as well, in particular, because it's a song about isolation.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's got an intense sort of beauty about it that makes you feel that there is hope even within. I'm bloody telling the story now. Tell the story about how that came, that particular piece came about.
Again, this was very much about an extra musical idea, because it was what I was going through emotionally. I've always had a fear of the dark, even as a child, and growing up in Jamaica there are lots of superstitions and duppies. Duppies, that's brilliant. And stories, about ghosts and rolling calf and all this business. And so that's never left me. But we decided to move out to the country, and it's very much part my idea as well. And we moved to this quite isolated place. And Tom, of course, was still going into London quite a lot to work, and I'm sure I could feel sort of presences, and I was absolutely terrified, I think partly because it was so different. You can't hear anything apart from wildlife out in the garden and out around. And this was plaguing me for months and months, and I thought, I must find a way of exercising this. And I thought, well, why don't I write a piece about it? And that's exactly how it came about. And I wanted to contrast and juxtapose the ideas of beauty. The moon, that's such a beautiful thing, and yet it happens at night, and there are these mysteries and these dangers concerned. It's probably, my cave woman brain remembering all this. And so I wanted to put those two things together, and the idea of this, the succubi and the succubi and incubi, and those sort of demonic ideas, because as humans, especially earlier on, when we have these strong emotions, and especially fear and things like that, we try to find some story to put it on. So I wanted to use all those things, and that's how it happened.
And did it help you?
It did. I felt quite different after I'd written it.
There you go.
It was much better.
We found the reason for music. Eleanor, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
I think we're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.